from a federal prison.
If you go back and watch the film, they was already stalking Pac. There was a plan already to do something to him. And the sad thing about it, Orlando wasn't even the shooter, you know?
In a 2020 prison interview done with Suge Knight by author Michael Douglas Carlin, Suge Knight claimed that Orlando Anderson, who became the #1 suspect and was interrogated for the murder of Tupac, was not actually the shooter. Suge Knight, being in the same car while the incident took place and sustaining injuries to the head and chest, claimed in a TV documentary that he looked the shooter directly in the eyes, then also later claiming it was not Orlando Anderson.
I get hit in the head, I immediately look up. When I look up, I see the, the fear in his big eye.
As for who Suge Knight named in the prison interview, what he revealed is so scandalous that any time we have tried to report on it while including who he named, the video has been pulled due to name dropping. In this video, we're going to take a look into what Suge Knight had to say about the Tupac murder case in some of his prison interviews. Suge Knight is currently serving a 28-year prison sentence for voluntary manslaughter after causing vehicular manslaughter during an incident in 2015. Before his fall from grace, Suge Knight was responsible for one of the most prominent gangster rap record labels in history, being Death Row Records. Suge Knight was a bodyguard to artist Bobby Brown in the late 1980s, where he observed the music industry. Him being from Compton, California, was associated with the Mob Piru Blood Street Gang, who he used them to get what he wanted. Suge Knight in 1991 stepped foot into the music industry by forcing artist Vanilla Ice to sign over percentage points of his hit record Ice Ice Baby, which were worth $4 million. Suge Knight done this after him and Blood gang members waited inside Vanilla Ice's hotel room, then Suge Knight took him out onto a balcony and threatened him into signing over the percentage points. Suge Knight in the following year of 1992 formed a relationship with Compton producer Dr. Dre, who was signed to Eazy-E's record label Ruthless Records. Dr. Dre got a copy of his record contracts over at Ruthless Records, which Suge Knight then took over to record producer Dick Griffey, who revealed to him that Dr. Dre was only making a few pennies per each copy sold of the songs that he worked on.
They had the worst contracts I've ever seen in the history of the record business.
Suge Knight once again used his gangster tactics as he, along with Blood gang members, went to the offices of Ruthless Records, getting Eazy-E to sign release papers for Dr. Dre and other artists. Suge Knight and Dr. Dre then wanted to start a new label, being Death Row Records. Michael Harry O. Harris was a drug trafficker who had connections to the Colombian cartels. He was serving time in prison in 1992 for murder, and his cellmate was Freeway Rick Ross, who was a drug kingpin in Los Angeles, who was implicated in the Iran-Contra affair. This was a political scandal in the United States, which implicated intelligence agencies being complicit with the drug trade in America to fight communism in Nicaragua. Harry O, while in prison, was working on his wife Lydia's album, and Freeway Rick Ross recommended that he get Dr. Dre to produce it. Suge Knight started to visit Harry O in prison, where a deal was struck with an investment of $1.2 million to start up Death Row Records, with it being a parent company of Godfather Entertainment, owned by Harry O. Suge Knight, as part of the deal, had to take on Harry O's criminal defense attorney David Kenner to become not only the attorney for the label, but also the entertainment attorney for the artists. Suge Knight and Dr. Dre then launched Death Row Records after getting distribution from Interscope Records. Dr. Dre released his debut album The Chronic in 1992, which generated $50 million in sales, selling 5 million records at $10 a copy. In the first year of operations from 1992 to 1993, with the release of The Chronic and Snoop Dogg's debut studio album Doggy Style, Suge Knight amassed over $150 million in revenue.
Very first year, I generated $150 million.
Kevin Hackey was a former Compton cop who was police partner to Reggie Wright Jr., whose father was head of Compton's gang division. Compton PD was later found to be so corrupt that it was disbanded in September of 2000. Kevin Hackey was approached by the FBI and ATF to go undercover and work security, posing as a bodyguard to get information about the label. This was due to his connection to his former police partner Reggie Wright Jr. Reggie Wright Jr. became the head of security for Death Row Records after his police intelligence got wind of a plot that the Bloods were planning to kidnap Suge Knight and hold him for ransom. Suge Knight was told of the plot and paid Reggie Wright Jr. $300,000 to start Right Way's Protective Services, which provided police protection for Death Row. LAPD Detective Russell Paul filed police reports which claimed corrupt cops from the LAPD Rampart Division were allegedly working security for $75 per hour. The Rampart scandal was one of the worst police corruption scandals in US history, where the cops shared matching tattoos and awarded each other with playing cards as trophies for shooting suspects and civilians. Kevin Gaines was a Rampart cop who was found to be dating Suge Knight's ex-wife Sharifa Knight, who was in charge of Nightlife Entertainment, which was the management company of Death Row artists. Sharifa Knight was managing Snoop Dogg and revealed during a phone call with Reggie Wright Jr. that Snoop Dogg was paying Kevin Gaines cash out of his own pocket to supply security.
Kevin Gaines, did you ever cut him some checks from Death Row Records?
No. Even when he worked, they were paid cash by Snoop.
Suge Knight had once taken Kevin Gaines out to the desert and made him strip down and threatened him after finding out he had been dating his ex-wife. Kevin Hackey began bodyguarding Tupac once he signed to the label in 1995. Tupac Shakur was an American artist who was signed to Interscope Records in the early and mid-1990s. He was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison in 1994, being the day after he was shot 5 times in the lobby of a recording studio in New York. Tupac was recording verses for a mixtape by DJ Ron G on November 30th, 1994, and while there, he was getting messages on his beeper from music manager and convicted drug trafficker Jimmy Henchman. Henchman was with Puff Daddy at Quad Recording Studio in Manhattan, as Puffy was overseeing his artist Biggie Smalls, who was hosting his group Junior Mafia's first ever studio session. Henchman offered Tupac $7,000 to come to the studio, and when he arrived, it was an ambush where Tupac was shot 5 times, with bullets being lodged in the back of his skull. Tupac had saw it as people had put a hit out on him, as he had been talking about a group of people connected to Henchman while on the news, which were implicated in the criminal trial which Tupac was caught up in. Therefore, he saw it as retaliation. Tupac after this had beef with Puffy and Biggie, as Puffy was with Jimmy Henchman in the studio. Therefore, Tupac believed they were somewhat involved in the incident. The day after, while in a wheelchair and bandaged up, he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. While serving prison time in New York, Suge Knight, Reggie Wright Jr., along with David Kenner, began visiting him in prison, while David Kenner worked on an appeal to get him released from prison. Tupac was released from prison under the appeal of David Kenner in October of 1995 and started making music for Death Row Records. Tupac and Suge Knight now both had a feud with Puffy and Biggie, as Suge Knight also had a feud with Puff Daddy after he was blamed for the murder of Suge Knight's close friend and Blood gang member Jake Robles. Puffy formed an alliance with Southside Compton Crips to come to his concerts in Los Angeles while he was there, with hopes that they would protect him and his interests from the Bloods and Suge Knight. Some of these Crips consisted of Keefy D and his nephew Orlando Anderson. Orlando Anderson was involved in a chain-snatching incident of Blood gang member and Suge Knight associate Trayvon Lane in a Foot Locker store in Los Angeles in April of 1996. Suge Knight in 1996 was planning to create Death Row East, which was going to be a New York version of the label. Suge teamed up with New York artist Eric B alongside Big D To begin with the venture, where they informed him that Tupac had to settle the beefs he had with New York on a record before launching the East Coast label. Hit 'Em Up, the infamous diss track towards Puffy, Biggie and other East Coast artists, then came about, which was released on June 4th, 1996. The video featured impersonators of Biggie and Puffy, and Tupac made remarks of sleeping with Biggie's wife, Faith Evans. Kevin Hackey, the undercover FBI asset, was bodyguarding Tupac after he joined Death Row, and leading up to Tupac's murder in September of 1996, Hackey confirmed the wiretap conversations of Death Row personnel were filled with suspicious information about an upcoming Vegas trip. Tupac Shakur was forced into traveling to Las Vegas on September 7th, 1996 by death row lawyers and a judicial system. This was as he was charged with community service 2 weeks prior to the trip. Death row attorney struck a deal where, to avoid jail time, he would have to perform a benefit gig for a Metro police officer in Las Vegas at Club 662 on September 7th, 1996 to avoid jail time. Club 662 was trying to be purchased by Suge Knight, with the owner being a Las Vegas businesswoman by the name of Helen Thomas. The benefit gig Tupac had to perform at to avoid jail time was a charitable event for a Metro police officer, where Suge Knight was encouraged to invite celebrities to help raise awareness for the charity. Mike Tyson was supposed to appear at the event at the club following a boxing match he had at the MGM Grand Hotel, which Tupac and Suge Knight attended. Tupac's bodyguards, Frank Alexander, along with Michael Moore and other security, met with head of security, former Compton cop Reggie Wright Jr. at the house of the attorney for Club 662 on the morning of the trip. Kevin Hackey was assigned not to go to Las Vegas, although Reggie Wright Jr. attempted to employ him for the night. Kevin Hackey at the time had Frank Alexander's radio with him, which inconveniently shut down communications with security. FBI documents show that although Snoop Dogg didn't go to Las Vegas, Kevin Gaines was there on a special assignment for the LAPD. He was there 2 days prior to Death Row showing up to 2 days after Tupac's death. Sharifa Knight and Reggie Wright Jr. discussed in a phone call how Kevin Gaines was paid for something which happened in Las Vegas, but Suge Knight didn't know about it.
Kevin Gaines, did you ever cut him some checks from Buffalo Records?
No. Even when he worked, they were paid cash by Snoop. Not unless it was that whole other thing. Nobody knew about the whole thing.
No, let me just say this.
Frank Alexander and Michael Moore, along with other security, have gone on record to explain that the attorney for Club 662, along with the head of security, told them not to carry weapons that day while guarding Tupac.
We were all told not to carry any weapons. We were told to leave our guns in our car.
Reggie Wright Jr. has defended these claims by saying that he told the security not to carry their weapons while in the club. However, after Michael Moore refused to give up his weapon, Reggie Wright Jr. made him stay at Club 662.
I had two of the toughest guys for him, and Reggie pulled him off of me. It didn't have to happen.
Suge Knight and Tupac went and watched a boxing match at the MGM Grand, and after leaving, they saw Crip gang member Orlando Anderson, who had snatched Trayvon Lane's chain just months before. Trayvon Lane, who was with them, pointed out Orlando Anderson, and Tupac then rushed over and attacked him, along with Suge Knight and the Death Row entourage. This was captured on CCTV, along with them storming out afterwards. Suge Knight and Tupac were shot at shortly after while traveling to Club 662 so Tupac could perform. In a prison interview, Suge Knight claimed that Frank Alexander told him that he got orders to block them in.
Frank blocked us in purposely. Later he told us that they told him to do it.
In a TV documentary, he also claimed someone who messed with Reggie cut in front of them, with this being K-Dub.
As we getting right up to this point right here, one of the little dudes who deal with Reggie, for something that he know not to do, he cuts in front of us. As he cuts in front of us, the Cadillac starts to shoot.
Tupac was hit 4 times while Suge Knight had head injuries and injuries to the chest. Orlando Anderson's uncle Keefe D was recorded by former LAPD cop Greg Caden confessing that Orlando Anderson was the shooter. Suge Knight, in a prison interview done recently, claimed Orlando Anderson was not the shooter.
And the sad thing about it, Orlando wasn't even the shooter, you know?
Tupac was cremated after his death, and a Compton cop by the name of James Green was responsible for transporting his ashes back to Los Angeles. James Green was at Club 662 supplying police security for Reggie Wright Jr. Suge Knight was sentenced to 9 years in prison for the assault on Orlando Anderson. Orlando Anderson was arrested during the Compton raid and he was handed over to the Las Vegas PD, but they had no interest in him, believing he was not the shooter in the case. While Suge Knight was incarcerated, former Compton cop Reggie Wright Jr. became in charge of operations at Death Row Records, getting advice from David Kenner. The label then generated a fortune releasing Tupac's songs after his death, which spanned a catalogue of many albums. In this video, we took a look into some claims Suge Knight made in a recent prison interview concerning the murder of Tupac Shakur. He claimed Orlando Anderson was not the shooter, and he also went on to name people but were unable to include it. The case still remains unsolved today and will probably never be solved. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, smash the thumbs up button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and press the bell button so you can get all the future notifications for when I upload. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.